Hello and welcome back to Law Torn, the podcast that explores what happens when family fights turn into legal battles. I'm Samara Dutton, a partner in our private wealth disputes team, and I'm here with my co-host Philippa. Hello, Philippa.
Hello, Samara.
Who is a partner in our family team. It's our first recording for 2026. And we are looking at the sort of darker side, I think, of Christmas. Christmas obviously is painted in the adverts and all the media, etc., as a happy, joyful family time. But for many, that isn't the reality, I think. And as a starting point to that, there is this kind of idea that divorces increase post-Christmas. And I did take a look at some statistics to see whether we could prove that. But actually, it seems that is something of a myth. And it's not the case. So what's your experience?
Well, we had this conversation because I've always been very cynical about the idea that, everyone feels terrible on the third Monday after of January, whatever the
Blue Monday,
Monday and all this nonsense. And I personally have not felt that we get a whole load of new divorce clients at the beginning of January. I think there is a sense, a bit like planning holidays, people sort of want to plan the rest of their lives if they're having a horrible Christmas. And I think there's a bit of that. And I don't know whether the statistics support the idea there's more divorce. It's not my personal experience, but they tell me.
No, they don't seem to. They do talk about this sort of media's divorce day being the first working Monday after Christmas, when there's supposed to be a spike in inquiries about divorce, but it doesn't seem that actual divorces go up or down particularly at that time. But I mean, yes, you can certainly sense that you're sort of together more, aren't you? It's quite an extended break usually for most people. Often you take the 1 or 2 weeks. Presumably you go and see family, which can help or hinder good relations, I think.
Probably hinder if you're unhappily married.
Yeah, well, it depends whose family you're visiting. I mean, does Christmas sort of impact on relationships, do you think, in any other way? If it doesn't necessarily force people towards divorce, what's your experience of
it? You're right that they're spending time together, and if they're not happily married, and you've got blended families as well, so whether you've got your stepchildren there as well as your children, and then you've got to have communication with the other parent of your stepchildren in some way. It goes on and on. I think partly there is this idea that it's obviously a happy, joyful family time. I mean, there's so much coverage of homeless families and lonely old people. I mean, I'm not sure even that isn't. I don't think that many people believe everyone's happy over Christmas, but certainly it's more stressful if you've got complicated issues within the family. And I mean, to start with, December, suddenly there'll be a what's happening at Christmas, who's having the children. This is if you've separated and you've got a blended family, who's having the children, who's having them when. There's a practice that you switch Christmas and New Year each year. So assuming you're separated and you're going to have the children for one or other of those two ends, and of course Christmas is much more important than whether you're going to be able to go out and drink with your friends on New Year's Eve or stay in with a couple of young children. I mean, it's a sort of no-brainer as far as I can see. But there is that sort of concept that you'll have either Christmas or New Year, and then people go away increasingly over Christmas.
Well, how does that actually work? My understanding is if you have separated, if you've gone through a divorce, then as part and parcel of that process, you will have reached an agreement on how these holidays will be split, where you have young children, and you effectively make that decision rather than them, I suppose. Does that get upset often? Shouldn't you know already?
Well, yes. It depends. If you've gone to court or, saber rattled about how children's time is shared, and you've ended up in a relatively formal way, then probably there will be, if not a court order, then at least an agreement in writing, possibly through solicitors, that will split the year as follows. And some people have really detailed schedules of who has the children when, but there's a practice that you'll alternate Christmas and New Year and probably Easter as well, and then you'll have children's birthdays are split, and then you'll have maybe Mother's Day will always be with the mother, and then the father says, well, hang on, what about Father's Day? So there's that kind of toing and froing.
What happens if children are very upset and the parent who's not supposed to have them decides that actually them not being upset is more important than following some kind of court order and says you can't have them to the other parent? What happens if they ignore this agreement that they've made previously?
Probably nothing. There'll just be some angry solicitors' exchanges in the new year. I've had a case where the police have been called, but
would they get involved? Or
they
no?
had no interest at all in getting involved. But I mean, it has happened.
Yeah.
But obviously, it's a judgment of Solomon. Only a bad parent would drag the children kicking and screaming away from the home where they were desperate not to leave. But it's very complicated, and children aged 2 are very different from children aged 12 or 16 or whatever it is. And of course, teenagers more or less do what they like, regardless of whether there's a court order. And the younger children, people do tend to stick to the agreements they've reached, definitely, but there are exceptions, and we see the worst end because most people don't want to waste all that money on the solicitors. They'll sort out their children's arrangements between them. But the ones we see are the sort of the hard end of the spectrum. But I think it is stressful because it's Christmas and, oh, look, Daddy bought you a really, really expensive, I don't know, car, and I could only afford to.
But you can buy cars for toddlers now. These sort of electric ride-on vehicles.
Don't say that.
When in my youth, they were only at Harrods. There'd be like Range Rovers for children. But now it's pretty standard.
Yeah. But I mean, so obviously, presents, in-laws, blended families, and obviously an increasing issue. And people do go to court to argue about how they're going to split Christmas. And, they haven't happened the last few years. I think it's because the courts are so
slow
that you wouldn't get there in time.
Exactly.
But in the old days, you used to be able to sort of go down to court on the 21st of December and have an argument with the judge of the day if there was no agreement and it became very stressful.
So I can see the sense in having an argument then to have the impact. Well, now I've got a court order that they stay with me.
Yeah.
But if you, as I said, that's why I was sort of asking the question that if you ignore it, what actually happens? And then if the answer is nothing
happens. But in practice, what would happen is we would say to a client, don't go back to court because of breaches of the court order unless there's a pattern of breaches. So you really, if it happens once, I mean, I'm not saying it never happens, but it would be disproportionate. But if you have a pattern where people keep not keeping to the court order, then you'll log it all and then you'll turn it into an application. But very, very difficult to get, or for the judges, difficult for the judges to quite know what to do because it's all about the children. Children's welfare is primary. So, they'll have to say, well, what's right for these children? And then it's a whole philosophical debate.
But is it philosophical? Don't they sometimes do, again, depending on age, do they sometimes get the children to give views to
Oh, yeah.
people
Yeah,
that
yeah.
through
If you're having a formal process, then there'll come a stage where the children will be interviewed
by
by professionals, by social workers employed by the court, or because the budgeting constraints are so awful that there aren't enough of them, and
mm,
then
mm,
massive delays. Then you would employ, if you've got the money, again, this is all about people with the money, then you'd employ what's called an independent social worker, who's a sort of jointly appointed expert, who will interview the children, possibly go to the school, talk to the grandparents, see the children with each parent individually. But as far as Christmas is concerned, it's a bit of a one-off. Emotions are running high. People are drinking. There's no doubt that alcohol will sometimes make people behave not as well as they might do otherwise. So it can become a whole kind of screaming match and
which then
nightmare.
goes into some sort of witness statement or
Yeah,
evidence
or
about
goes
something
into angry solicitors' letters, possibly followed by an application to the
to
court.
change something
Yeah.
about the arrangements that you have. And you touched on, I think when you were talking just then, expensive gifts. Yes, I can see a difficulty there if you are the homemaker, if finances are stretched, etc., and then another parent comes in and sort of steals Christmas by wowing the children
Yeah.
with amazing toys, etc. I mean, presumably the answer again is there's nothing really you can do about that.
Well, you can. Well, if someone's pleaded poverty and said they can't afford to contribute to the school uniform, but they can go and buy some ludicrous thing for £1,000, then you probably would give you some ammunition
Mm-hmm.
to say, why aren't they contributing to those different types of more essential things that their children need? But no, you're right. On the day, what are you going to do? You're going to say, oh, lovely. Isn't
Yes.
Daddy kind? That's what you're going to
That's
say.
what you,
If you're a halfway decent parent.
yeah. Yes, I suppose so. Really, it's all just sort of evidence gathering for a future application of
Yeah.
some nature. But this is what we end up talking about all the time.
Yeah.
In that
Yeah.
moment, that the actual emotional impact of it all on you is something you the courts can't really help with.
No, because they're not there. They're not
Yeah.
in the room. And by January the 19th or July the 19th, because the list will be so long, you might think, do I really want to spend all this money?
Yeah.
I'm
You're sort of over you've
you're
dealt
over
with
it.
it.
Yeah.
Dealt
So
with
you
it
really
emotionally.
need to have strategies of friends or just finding things that you're going to enjoy doing. I'm talking about the parents here, that enable you to cope with it. But it is very emotional.
Yeah, really tricky.
If you've been married for 15 years and your husband, say, has left you for someone else and he's all happy and loved up and you're sad and lonely, and then there are these children saying, can we go and see Daddy? We want to see Daddy. We love Muriel, or whatever her name is. Then it's going to be, it's not easy.
No, absolutely. And going back to the sort of divorce type issue, if you've had an awkward Christmas with your partner, even without children
Yeah.
complicating factors, and you do think, obviously there will be a long history to it. You're not suddenly going to have a bad day and decide, right, that's it. Well, you might do, depending how temperamental you are. But if you come out of the Christmas period and say, do you know what, this relationship does not work for me. In the average case, if I then phone you on divorce day, so the first Monday in January, what am I then looking at undertaking, assuming everything proceeds? Because I just think people don't really know what's involved in the process of a divorce. Just sort of set out quickly, like how long. Obviously it's going to be how long's a piece of a string, but if everything is relatively straightforward and the partner also says, you're right, this isn't a relationship for us, and it's all no fault, there's no real contest around it. What are they facing in terms of court dates, hearings, what they have to do, and when they'll come out the other side?
Well, first, I'm assuming we're talking about married couples, because unmarried couples are completely different.
Yes.
And if there are no children, there's no
Yeah.
claim anyway.
No, I suppose it's
But
if you have reached a decision, I'm going to divorce this person, which is a terrifying decision to reach in most circumstances anyway. What are they then facing if everything goes well?
so if someone phones you, the first thing you say is, "Are you sure?" I mean, it
Yeah.
sounds a bit obvious. Have you tried couples counselling? Have you thought it through? Assuming they're absolutely sure, then you would, spell out the process, which is write to the other side, write to him or her individually. If they haven't got a lawyer, then say we're going to issue a divorce application, start the divorce application process, which takes a minimum of 26 weeks, by the way, and that's nothing to do with money or children. That is purely the process of getting to dissolve the marriage.
So that's 6 months straight away.
Yeah, straight away, minimum.
Yeah.
And people can do that themselves, actually, because they have now put stuff on the online, which is quite easy to manage because there's no fault, so you don't have to worry too much about that. But assuming if you've got money issues or children, then it becomes more complicated, obviously. And then, you'll try and settle it if it's about either. You'll say, then you'd probably say, have you thought about mediation? You're always trying to get these people out of your door, away from court. So then you might say, go to mediation, assuming that the person on the other side would agree to mediate because it's voluntary, and that they're not violent or in some way incapable of creating a level playing field for the negotiations, which a mediator should pick up. So you'd probably try mediation. And then, often people have already tried couples counselling and so on, and they know they're at the end of the road and they want to see the new year with a bit of a positive outlook and change. Then you would say to them, it can cost, we're in central London, so it's not going to be cheap. If you then engage in financial disclosure about what everyone's got, what the house is worth, what the pensions are worth, what the savings are worth, or the second home in Cornwall or whatever it is. But that's a process that's going to take months. You would try and negotiate some settlement with the other side, assuming both of them have got lawyers. If one person doesn't have a lawyer, it's incredibly difficult to negotiate a settlement because you're tiptoeing around as the lawyer. You can't mislead the other person. You can't give them advice.
Yeah.
It really is. It's a bit of a nightmare. And of course, if they're incredibly angry and rude to you, as they are sometimes, you just respond with charm and grace. So
Which is always simple.
Which is
part of the job.
Well, it's part of the job. But it's a messy road, and it's a long road and an expensive road. If you then engage with the court and you can't settle it, either through solicitors or in mediation. And if you go to mediation, you'll then ideally have a lawyer to sort of check what you've agreed, point out any weaknesses, draft the formal documents.
Anything you've missed or haven't,
anything you just haven't thought of. I've had a few cases recently on both sides where my clients agreed to have everything, or someone who's agreed to have virtually nothing. And you point things out to them, but if they just want to get on with their lives, or the person on the other side feels terribly guilty, just wants to give it away. In fact, there is this element of, move quickly if the other side feels really guilty, because they tend to be more generous. And then once you're in a new relationship, their generosity dissipates.
They want it back.
Yeah.
But then you've got a signed settlement agreement. Yeah. Okay, but so if you do manage to settle it, the assets are quite straightforward, both of you are quite reasonable and fair, and everything sort of needs to be done, or you both want everything to be done broadly on a kind of equal basis, and as quickly and efficiently as possible, you could come out of that procedure within the year.
Oh yes, you could come out of it in 26 weeks and a day.
You can, if you get all of
Yeah,
that
because you start
decided.
the process, you then have 20 weeks from the date you started to when you can apply for the next stage, which is now confusingly called the conditional order, whereas when it was the decree nisi, everyone knew what it was.
Yeah.
But so you've got that 20 weeks when, with a fair wind
And
and
will on both
and
sides. Yeah.
goodwill, that's long enough probably to get the house valued, decide how long you're going to stay in it, whether you're going to sell it when the kids are 18 or whether you can't afford it because the other person's entitled to 50% of the equity, probably. So you'll have to sell. Maintenance, child maintenance is relatively simple if you're following the formula. And if you're not, and you can argue about that. Spousal maintenance i.e. for the wife, probably, or the husband, then it's more debatable.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not forever. Whereas with capital, if you come to a deal, you're stuck with it. If
Mm.
it's maintenance, then you can always revisit it. So if we're looking at people trying to do this without lawyers' involvement, you'll probably struggle to do the last bit, which is the financial order, because that'll have to be drafted, and you might want to go to a lawyer just to give a bit of advice and have a one-off
But you could
drafting exercise.
theoretically reach the agreement,
Yeah.
and then set out sort of heads of terms to a solicitor. And you can, in family law, you can appoint one family lawyer for both of you now, can't you?
Funny enough, we were talking about it earlier. I can't get my head round how that is going to work unless it's the simplest of cases, simply because of the conflict of interest point. In other words, the lawyer's on your side, and if the lawyer's on your side, they can't also be on the other side because there'll always be elements of the deal that favour you as opposed to the other side. But if it's a simple case...
Well, I mean, just from my experience, like often instructions that I get are from two parties where you can see that although they are agreed on this specific point, so sort of two beneficiaries of an estate, so they both want something to happen with one asset of the trust, but that doesn't necessarily mean that in the longer term they're going to agree on everything, and there's always the potential that they might fall out about that specific issue too if something doesn't go their way somewhere else. And so you can sort of take those instructions, and I presume it would be the same here, that you would say, right, I will act for both of you because you are coming to me saying you both want the same outcome, and that within these kind of within this remit you will agree generally towards the same objective, and I can advise you of both sides of that. But at the point at which it is clear that we're not going to be able to have that agreement because you are now your sort of interests have diverged, then I have to step back completely, and you're going to have to go off. So you're going to have to go off and instruct separate lawyers.
Mm.
So I come out of the picture altogether. So there is a risk in choosing to only have one lawyer at the beginning, that the costs of that are completely wasted because
they won't be wasted.
No,
You'll have
you will
done financial disclosure.
but you're going to
you've
have to
got
then pay again for two
Yeah.
separate lawyers to look at everything again. And so I think as long as they understand that risk, it's...
Yes. And I mean, I'm sort of amazed on a daily basis at how much our costs are. And I couldn't afford.
No.
I couldn't afford them. So I would love to say that it can work in most cases to have one lawyer, but I think probably it doesn't. But I'm open to persuasion. It's just that I've been on several seminars and so on so far, and no one has yet been able to answer that question. That if there is a conflict,
What happens?
Either, one of them just gives in. I'm not closing my mind to the possibility.
It's an interesting development, though, isn't it? It's literally been sanctioned and sort of encouraged.
Oh yeah,
by
Revolution, our body, our professional body, now run courses and say, and it's partly because of the cost of divorce.
I was going to say that presumably is why, as a cost-saving measure. Anyway, it's definitely an interesting aspect of family law, because it's not that you don't have that in any other contentious situation. I mean, as I say, it can, but I have to look very carefully in those instances at whether or not professionally I can act for two people. I certainly don't have a higher authority telling me it's fine, carry on.
So anyway, how was your Christmas?
How was my Christmas? Well, thank you for asking, Philippa. It was good, thank you. Lots of children and lots of...
Oh, never mind.
Yeah, lots of children, lots of older people too. Because when we were talking about this episode and what we'd be speaking about, we knew that Christmas obviously is associated with divorce, and it's really interesting to hear from you about how Christmas can also impact on sort of children and family issues that way. But from my perspective, we were thinking, well, what links Christmas to my sort of practice area, which is obviously in the trust and estates disputes world. And the answer, that the most obvious thing that I will come up with Christmas may bring to the fore is sort of capacity issues with elderly relatives, or not necessarily elderly, but vulnerable for any other reason. Because
explain capacity.
So the sort of issues around whether your family members who normally you see once or twice a year or you phone for 10 minutes to check in on, and you've always thought, well, they're slightly eccentric characters, but there's, they live their own life. It's just that around Christmas time, you may end up spending a more consecutive amount of time with them,
and guilt gets the best of you,
and you may think, well, I should spend a bit more time with them, and here they are, sit down and talk to them, and during those conversations you may sort of start thinking, well, actually that eccentricity might be more of an issue, and is this person actually completely in touch with their reality, and the question really is, can they look after themselves, isn't it? It's that I don't really want the responsibility of having to care for this member of my family, and I've always thought they were doing all right, that they've had slight mad things happen to them, but everything's okay. But now that I'm seeing them on Christmas Day and Boxing Day, trying to have conversations with them, I'm actually a bit worried that they're not quite getting what's going on here, and how does that impact on their day-to-day living if they're living independently on their own, etc. And that capacity, that ability to manage your own affairs and manage your health and welfare, that's what I mean by capacity.
Yeah.
And that is a increasingly live and hot issue in the area I practice.
Because people are physically getting that they're living longer.
Much longer.
And then, so you're right, it can be concealed from other people. And then you get, we'll do a whole thing on this, a whole session on this, and then you find that there's some helpful neighbour next door who's 40 years younger, who they seem to be very fond of. And then you worry there are predatory people who
Absolutely.
are hanging around.
And it can, so there's a whole area of sort of advice and organisations that can help with what's often called sort of financial abuse or elder abuse, and what you're specifically talking about there is a kind of, the risk is predatory marriage. So where an individual who is, has wavering capacity is sort of being preyed upon by a younger person with a view to probably marrying them, and in marrying them, invalidating any will they have. And then because they are their spouse, on the intestacy that results when they die shortly thereafter, because they are elderly or unwell, they'll take the lion's share of the estate.
Well, that's thinking ahead a lot. But
yes, yeah. And and it is a fascinating area. But actually some of what the Law Commission has recommended recently means that it might not be so much of a problem, but it is definitely one
right. So
for
look
a future
out
week.
For slightly dippy older relatives.
Yeah, I think
at your Christmas table.
Just from the point of view that how Christmas might bring about claims or action or anything that you need to take that touches on my practice area. Well, I think, Philippa, that's been really interesting discussion around some of the issues that might arise because of Christmas time. I think there's probably a number of things that we could have spoken about that we haven't. I know that, some of them we can leave for future episodes, I think.
Yes. And just before you go, I realise we've been a bit negative about Christmas, which actually is really a joyful time of the year. And some people might be interested to come away thinking, well, I could start my divorce in January, and as long as I don't use solicitors very much, I could be free in time for my summer holiday.
Which is another happy thought. So I think it just remains to say thanks for listening and join us on our next episode. Bye.